Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the dusty roads of a small frontier town, the burn of a relentless sun overhead, and the hollow echo of footsteps in an abandoned saloon. On a stretch of land known for its raw grit and untamed spirit, a young woman found herself traded like an object sold to an aging rancher whose reputation for cruelty spread far beyond county lines. This is her story, one of heartbreak, resilience, and a courage she never knew she possessed. And it's also the story of a quiet cowboy whose unspoken vow was to rescue her from a fate worse than death. Eva Carter's earliest memory was the feel of prairie winds threading through her hair as she leaned against the warped railing of her parents' porch. She had been born in a small, wind-swept cabin outside Santa Fe, a place where tumbleweeds drifted by like ghosts, and every sunrise painted the sky in bold shades of rose and gold. But in the last year, life had taken a harsh turn. Her father died in a ranching accident, leaving Eva and her mother alone with debts piling at the door. Their land was mortgaged, and the local men whispered that the Carters would lose everything if they didn't find a way to repay. With her mother's health declining, Eva had been desperate for a lifeline. She took on any work she could, mending clothes, gathering eggs, even cleaning out stables for pennies. But it wasn't enough to halt the slow collapse of the only home she'd ever known. Then, as if summoned by misfortune itself, an old rancher named Horace McAllister appeared. Known in neighboring counties for his cunning and ruthless streak, McAllister offered to pay off the Carter family's debts. But it was not an act of charity. He demanded Eva's hand in marriage as payment. Eva had no illusions about McAllister. He was a man in his late 50s, stooped from years of labor, but still imposing with broad shoulders and dark, calculating eyes. She had heard stories, whispers, about how he treated his workers, the scars he left behind. Despite her fears, Eva's mother insisted that she consider his proposal. They were out of options. Either they accepted McAllister's terms, or the small patch of land they called home would be swallowed by the bank. Torn between loyalty to her ailing mother and the terror at what marriage to McAllister might entail, Eva felt her world closing in. Ultimately, she chose to protect her mother. Within a month, the carriage arrived at the Carter homestead, and Eva, just 19 years old, walked out in a tattered dress that once belonged to her grandmother. McAllister barely glanced at her. He handed a sheaf of documents to Eva's mother, ensuring the debt was cleared, then hoisted Eva into the carriage as though she were a piece of cargo. The ride to McAllister Ranch was silent, except for the crack of the driver's whip. Eva gripped the edge of the seat, staring at the dusty road, and wondering how her life had narrowed to this bleak path. Even the sky was grey that day, as if mourning the freedom she left behind. When they arrived, McAllister barely waited to show her around. His ranch house was large, made of dark wood that had seen better days. The windows were always shuttered, casting the interior into a permanent gloom. A handful of ranch hands stopped their work to watch the new mistress step down from the carriage. None of them smiled. They recognized the look of someone who had been forced into a deal. Standing there, Eva felt the weight of it all like a yoke pressing on her shoulders. She was no longer free. She was property. Life at the McAllister Ranch was a test of mental and physical endurance. Eva rose before dawn each day, shadows still clinging to the edges of the horizon, to prepare breakfast and then tend to an endless list of chores. McAllister was relentless about keeping his property and his household in order. He demanded obedience, punctuality, and perfection. If dinner was not on the table exactly when he expected, or if the stables were not mucked to his satisfaction, Eva would see his dark scowl and feel his menacing energy simmering like a pot about to boil over. Among the ranch hands was a middle-aged man named Rufus Johnson, who had worked for McAllister for nearly a decade. Rufus walked with a limp from an old injury, and though he never dared confront the boss openly, he offered Eva small kindnesses, a warm cup of tea, a gentle word, or a warning about McAllister's mood. It was Rufus who quietly shared that McAllister had once been married before to a woman named Martha, who had run off under mysterious circumstances. Rumors around town said that McAllister had driven Martha away with his cruelty, though no one knew if she was truly still alive. The ranch's isolation heightened Eva's sense of entrapment. The nearest neighbor was miles away, separated by a patchwork of rolling hills and dusty roads. On Sundays, she would walk to the far edge of the property, under the pretense of gathering wildflowers, just to feel the breeze across her face and imagine a life beyond. Sometimes she'd see travelers on horseback or wagons headed to Santa Fe, and her heart would tighten with longing. The only silver lining, if it could be called that, was that McAllister seemed more concerned with showing her off as his young bride than forcing intimacy upon her. He treated her like a prized possession, trotting her out in front of guests or in town to display his power and wealth. Eva soon realized it wasn't love he desired, but control. She endured comments about how lucky she was to have a provider, all while her spirit withered under his watchful eye. One evening after a dinner, where McAllister had drunk far too much whiskey, he cornered Eva in the small parlor where she sometimes embroidered. His breath stank of alcohol, and the red veins in his eyes mirrored the fury in his voice. He accused her of not respecting him enough, of looking at the ranch hands too kindly, of thinking she was above her station. For the first time, he raised his hand to her. Though he didn't strike with full force, the blow was enough to bruise her cheek and leave her trembling. Later that night, Eva locked herself in the room that was meant to be her marital bedroom. The bruise throbbed on her face, but what hurt more was the realization that she was truly alone. She pressed her ear against the door and listened to McAllister's heavy footsteps pacing the hallway. Eventually, he staggered to his own room, slamming the door behind him. In the solitude that followed, Eva's tears came in waves, each sob breaking the silence of the dark. Every corner of the house felt haunted. The shadows along the walls seemed to close in, and the stifling air in the room was suffocating. She touched the bruise on her cheek and felt a flash of anger slice through her despair. She prayed perhaps for a miracle, perhaps for an escape. Days turned to weeks, and Eva settled into a grim routine. Her chores were endless, and McAllister's temper swayed with the wind. Some days he seemed almost civil, patting her on the shoulder and feigning concern for her mother's health. Other days he was a storm, dark clouds in his eyes, punishing everyone in his path for the slightest infraction. Rufus remained a quiet ally, steering Eva out of the rancher's way whenever he could. She quickly learned to keep her head down, respond with "yes, sir," and "no, sir," and avoid igniting McAllister's anger. One afternoon, while Eva was collecting eggs in the henhouse, she overheard a conversation between two ranch hands, Gil and Paco. They spoke in low voices about a new cowboy passing through town. He was said to be a drifter, a man from Texas with a mysterious past, stopping in Santa Fe to rest his horse and find temporary work. Some folks said he'd once been a lawman. Others whispered he'd been on the run from the law. His name, James Landon, was on the lips of every saloon patron, or so the ranch hands claimed. Eva's ears perked up at the mention of James Landon. It wasn't that she expected him to be her savior, but any news of an outsider felt like a lifeline of hope. She clung to the words, storing the name in her memory as if it might somehow matter. That evening, when she served McAllister his whiskey and stew, Eva caught a snippet of conversation about an upcoming livestock auction in Santa Fe. Joseph McCoy, a well-known cattle trader historically credited with turning small ranches into booming industries, was rumored to be passing through. McAllister planned to attend both to flaunt his wealth and perhaps to make some business deals. In the swirl of that conversation, a few ranchers also mentioned James Landon. They called him the Quiet Texan, a man who could break horses with a gentle hand, but rarely spoke more than a few words at a time. Eva noted how McAllister's lip curled in disdain at the mention of Landon. He had little respect for drifters, especially ones who captured attention or admiration. "I've seen his type before," McAllister grunted. "They blow in with the wind blow out just as fast. Nothing but trouble." Still, a seed of curiosity had planted itself in Eva's mind. A quiet cowboy, rumored to be decent, passing through a place so full of corruption and cruelty. Something about it intrigued her. She had no illusions, though. Even if James Landon appeared at the ranch gate, McAllister would never let him within 100 yards of Eva. As the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky in a deep crimson, Eva finished her chores. She took a moment to linger by the corral, watching the horses stomp and snort in the cool evening air. She pressed a gentle hand to the flank of a bay mare, finding comfort in the animal's steady warmth. She whispered, "I wish I could ride away too." For a second, Eva imagined a scenario, someone from beyond this dusty realm stepping in, offering her a chance at a different life. But that was just fantasy, something out of a dime store novel. Real life was far crueler, and she'd learned that well enough. Still, as she walked back to the house under the darkening sky, she couldn't shake the faint spark of hope flickering inside her. It was early April when the McAllister Ranch prepared for the livestock auction in Santa Fe. McAllister insisted that Eva accompany him to demonstrate the ranch's respectable family image. In truth, he wanted to flaunt her youth and remind the local businessmen of his standing. For Eva, the trip was bittersweet. She hadn't visited Santa Fe since before her father died, and the memories rushed back in full color. Her father tipping his hat to passers-by, the bustle of wagons and stagecoaches in the streets, and the spicy aroma of chili peppers being sold by vendors. At the same time, McAllister's presence loomed over her. She felt his iron grip on her arm whenever they walked among the crowds. The livestock auction was held in a massive corral on the outskirts of town. Cattle bellowed, horses neighed, and cowhands shouted, creating a cacophony of noise that reverberated through the dusty air. Buyers and sellers congregated in clusters, exchanging bills of sale over the horns of restless animals. It was in this swirl of chaos that Eva first laid eyes on James Landon. He stood near a pen of horses, wearing a battered Stetson hat pulled low over his eyes, a faded blue bandana around his neck, and well-worn boots caked with dust. His stance was relaxed but alert, as if he was perpetually ready to move. Even from a distance, Eva noticed something different about him. Perhaps the way he didn't brag like other cowboys, or how he seemed to handle a skittish stallion with just a whisper and a firm hand. McAllister was busy bargaining over cattle prices with a large man from Arizona, so Eva seized the moment to drift closer to the horse pen. She could hear James murmuring softly to a fretful mare, his voice barely above the wind. When he turned around, their eyes locked for a split second. The look in his eyes wasn't the usual leering glance she got from men who saw her as a novelty. Instead, it was a curious, almost gentle gaze. She startled and quickly averted her eyes, heat rushing to her cheeks. McAllister's voice boomed from behind her, and she felt his bony fingers dig into her arm, pulling her back. "Come here," he barked. "I want you to meet Frank Watson and Joseph McCoy." Eva managed a polite smile, feeling McCoy's critical gaze as he sized up McAllister's operation. Watson was less subtle. He openly stared at Eva in a way that made her skin crawl. She stole another glance in James Landon's direction, but he had shifted away to help load a horse into a trailer. She shook herself from her reverie. Why was she drawn to this stranger? It made no sense. She reminded herself that she was bound to McAllister, her life entangled in his. Nonetheless, she felt a powerful longing, as though the mere presence of a man like James Landon symbolized all she could have been if fate had been kinder. Later that afternoon, the sun was beginning to sink when McAllister decided they'd stay overnight at a local inn. He had more deals to finalize and wanted to join some ranchers for poker in the saloon. Eva found herself sitting alone on the inn's porch, her eyes roaming the street. That was when James appeared again, leading a horse down the thoroughfare, presumably searching for stabling. He gave her a small nod when he noticed her removing his hat politely. Eva managed a quick nod in return, glancing nervously around to be sure McAllister wasn't watching. James paused as if he wanted to speak, but a raucous laugh from McAllister inside the saloon made him think twice. He tipped his hat again and disappeared into the stable yard. It was a brief encounter, barely a handful of seconds, but it resonated with Eva more than any moment in recent memory. She could not have guessed that this man would soon become her unexpected ally, or how that single nod would be the precursor to a spiral of events that would unravel everything. After returning to the ranch, Eva couldn't shake the image of James Landon. She found herself daydreaming during chores, recalling the way he handled that nervous mare, the gentle look in his eyes. Though she berated herself for clinging to such fleeting moments, a flicker of hope had sparked in her mind. McAllister, preoccupied with new livestock deals, paid little attention to Eva's distracted manner. He spent long hours in his study, poring over contracts and banknotes, occasionally erupting into foul curses if the numbers didn't match his liking. When he wasn't in his study, he rode out to his newly acquired pastures to assess the cattle. Eva was relieved. His absence offered short pockets of freedom. During one such moment, she snuck out to the barn where Rufus was mending a saddle. The man looked up with tired eyes, his graying hair streaked with sweat. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he warned softly. "If McAllister catches you, I just need a moment," Eva whispered. "To breathe." Rufus nodded understanding in his gaze. He offered her a stool and poured her a cup of water from a clay jug. The barn smelled of hay and horses, a scent that oddly calmed her. Eva took a moment to lean back against a wooden beam, letting her mind wander to that day in Santa Fe. Finally, she mustered the courage to ask, "Have you heard of a cowboy named James Landon?" Rufus paused, his brows knitting into a frown. "Landon. The Texan who's been drifting through these parts. I've heard a few folks mention him. They say he's been picking up ranch work here and there. Not a troublemaker by any means, but no one knows much about him." Eva's heart thumped a bit louder. "I just heard the name in town," she said, trying to sound casual, though her voice trembled slightly. "There was talk about him at the auction." Rufus gave her a knowing look, but said nothing more. Instead, he changed the subject, warning her about McAllister's short fuse. "He lost a card game in Santa Fe, and you know how he hates losing." Rufus sighed. "It's been rumored he's on edge because the ranchers he played with might have cheated him. Just mind your steps, Eva. Don't cross him right now." Eva nodded, her insides constricting with anxiety. McAllister's tantrums were enough to make the walls quake. She thanked Rufus for the water and retreated to the house, thoughts swirling in her mind about the quiet cowboy. She questioned what she expected a knight on a white horse galloping in to save her. That was a fantasy best left in storybooks. Yet the memory of James's steady gaze wouldn't let go. The next day, Eva gathered her courage and asked McAllister if she could go to the weekly market in Santa Fe. She fabricated an excuse about needing supplies that the ranch's traveling peddler couldn't provide. She even volunteered to pay from her household allowance. McAllister's eyes narrowed with suspicion, but eventually he relented on the condition she return by sundown. With each mile of the journey, Eva felt her lungs expand as though she'd been breathing stale air for weeks. She arrived in Santa Fe just past noon. Her errands were real enough, thread salt, a little sugar, but her eyes swept every street and building, hoping to catch a glimpse of that familiar Stetson or the outline of a tall, lean cowboy. She wandered through the marketplace, heart fluttering, each time she spotted someone wearing a dusty hat. But James Landon was nowhere to be found. Disappointment settled in like a sudden chill. She dropped by a small cafe for a quick lunch of cornbread and beans. An older waitress named Clara approached her with a sympathetic smile. "You look like you're searching for someone dear," she said kindly. Eva hesitated. "Just a friend I met at the auction," she replied, vaguely hoping she didn't sound too desperate. Clara smiled knowingly. "You mean that Texan who's been helping Doc Bailey break his horses?" "He was around 2 days ago, but I heard he left for Silver Creek. Won't be back for another week, maybe more." Eva's shoulders slumped, though she forced a polite smile. "Thank you," she managed, paying for her meal and leaving the cafe. A sense of emptiness followed her as she rode back to the ranch. The day's small window of freedom closed swiftly, overshadowed by the knowledge that she still belonged to McAllister. She walked through the ranch gates with heavy steps, her future as murky as the dusty twilight. A month slipped by without any new mention of James Landon. Eva resumed her routine of chores, walks to the edge of the ranch, and silent dreams. She grew more adept at reading McAllister's moods, sidestepping his anger whenever possible. Yet tension simmered beneath the surface, particularly as rumors circulated that McAllister's finances were not as robust as he projected. He owed money to various traders and was scrambling to keep up appearances. One scorching afternoon, Eva was scrubbing the veranda when she saw a rider approaching in the distance. It wasn't McAllister he had left hours earlier for a business meeting. As the figure neared, Eva's pulse quickened. It was James Landon, riding a sturdy chestnut horse at an easy gait. He tipped his hat when he spotted her, then slowed to a stop at the ranch entrance. Eva stood, heart pounding so loud she could barely hear. She glanced around, noting that most of the hands, including Rufus, were out in the fields. Gathering her nerve, she approached the fence. "Can I help you, mister?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. James cleared his throat. Up close, she noticed the small scar on his left cheek and a quiet kindness in his eyes. "I'm looking for work," he said. "Heard McAllister might be needing another hand. Some folks in town told me so." Her mind raced. McAllister would never let this man stay if he thought it might upset his tightly controlled household. Still, she couldn't help wanting him to remain, if only to see a friendly face. He's in Santa Fe," Eva explained. "He might be back by sundown, or maybe tomorrow." James studied her bruise-faded cheek, the fatigue in her eyes, and something changed in his expression. "You Mrs. McAllister?" he asked gently, though the question itself was like a blow. Eva swallowed hard. "Yes," she said, wishing the word didn't taste so bitter. "I'm sorry," he replied, But whether he was apologizing for the question or for her situation, Ava couldn't tell. They stood in awkward silence until James dismounted. "Mind if I water my horse and wait a bit? It's a long ride back." Ava felt an odd sensation, a conflict between the risk and the yearning to have him nearby. Ultimately, she nodded. "The trough is around the side," she said, pointing. "There's shade by the barn." While James led his horse to water, Eva glanced anxiously over her shoulder, half expecting McAllister to materialize, wrathful at the sight of another man on his property. But McAllister was nowhere to be seen. She told herself to remain calm. James lingered by the barn, using the time to study the ranch's layout. Eva noticed how he moved quiet, deliberate, as though every step was measured. The ranch hands drifted back eventually, each tipping a hat or giving a cautious nod to the newcomer. Rufus appeared last, giving James a guarded once-over before exchanging a few words. Eva didn't approach them, but she could see Rufus's lips move, likely warning that the boss was a hard man with specific rules. James simply nodded, expression unfazed. Something about his calmness, even in the face of McAllister's looming tyranny, made Eva feel both unsettled and oddly reassured. By late afternoon, McAllister still hadn't returned, and the desert sky began to blaze with sunset colors. James quietly saddled up his horse. He caught Ava's eye one final time. "Tell McAllister I stopped by," he said. "If he's interested, I'll be at the Broken Spur Saloon tomorrow around noon." Ava mustered a nod, her throat tight with anxiety. "I will," she replied. Then, as if compelled by a force beyond herself, she added, "Thank you." James's brow furrowed slightly in question. He nodded farewell and rode out into the purple-orange horizon. Eva watched him go until he was no more than a speck on the horizon, fighting a wave of sadness she didn't fully comprehend. She turned back to the house, wondering how to deliver this news to McAllister. But as night settled in, and her husband finally returned reeking of whiskey, she judged that it wasn't the right time. He was in a foul mood, slamming doors and cursing under his breath about filthy cheats and worthless deals. Eva kept her distance. Later that night, lying awake in bed, she stared at the ceiling beams. She wondered if James Landon would really be at the Broken Spur the next day. And if he was, would she dare to go there to speak to him on her own? The thought both thrilled and terrified her, like a spark in the darkness that threatened to grow into a blaze. That next morning, McAllister was still snoring in his study, slumped over paperwork and an empty whiskey bottle, when Eva slipped into the kitchen. She quietly prepared coffee, pausing at intervals to ensure he hadn't stirred. By the time the sun had fully risen, she made a decision she would ride into town under the guise of collecting supplies again. In truth, she wanted to find James at the Broken Spur to warn him that McAllister might not take kindly to his offer, or perhaps to see if there was any possibility, no matter how remote of an escape. Her hands shook as she saddled a gentle mare named Lady. She rarely rode alone anymore. McAllister didn't trust her outside his sight. Her heart pounded as she guided Lady out of the ranch gates, each hoofbeat sounding like the ticking of a clock counting down to a dangerous confrontation. The ride to Santa Fe took over an hour, sweat beading on her forehead under the already blazing sun. When she reached the edges of town, she guided Lady to a discreet hitching post near a livery stable. Walking the remaining blocks, Ava kept her head down, face partially hidden by the wide brim of her worn hat. The Broken Spur Saloon was a modest establishment with swinging wooden doors and chipped paint on its walls. The midday sun cast long shadows across the entrance. Swallowing her nerves, Eva pushed open the doors. The saloon's interior was dim, the smell of stale beer, old wood, and tobacco drifting in the air. James Landon was seated at a corner table, a glass of water in front of him. He looked up the moment Eva stepped inside, a flicker of surprise crossing his features. She wove through the nearly empty tables, ignoring the suspicious glances of an old bartender and the lone patron dozing at the bar. She slid into the chair opposite James, feeling her pulse roar in her ears. She began, then hesitated, unsure what exactly she intended to say. "I'm here to warn you. McAllister won't hire you, and if he sees you talking to me, it could go badly. For both of us." James regarded her calmly. "I figured as much," he said, voice low. "But I had to try. Heard he was looking for another hand. My business here is honest. Just need a way to earn a living for a while." Eva swallowed. Her words came out in a rush. "He's a cruel man, James. He forced me into marriage to pay off my family's debts. He won't let me leave. If you stay around, he might target you." James's eyes flickered with empathy. "I don't want to cause you trouble," he said softly. "But folks like McAllister only gain power when everyone's too scared to stand up to them." His voice was steady, carrying a conviction that made Eva's heart squeeze. She exhaled shakily, leaning in so their conversation remained private. "He's not just any bully. People have disappeared around him. His first wife ranch hands, he claimed, stole from him. No one has proof, but the rumors are enough to—" She stopped, feeling her voice quiver. James placed a hand on the table. Palm up, an unspoken invitation for trust. "Tell me exactly what you want, Eva," he said. "Because I see how you look like a bird in a cage." Tears pricked her eyes. "I want out," she whispered. "But I can't leave my mother behind. She's still living in my old home, near enough for McAllister to— He can hurt her if I run. He'll do anything to maintain control." Silence hung between them, heavy with possibility and dread. James finally spoke, his voice firm but compassionate. "Let me help you," he said. "I've dealt with men like McAllister before. Maybe not exactly like him, but I know the type. I can try to find a way, if you want me to." Eva closed her eyes, a tear slipping free. In the darkest hours, she had prayed for a miracle. Was this it, or was she risking an even worse fate? "You could get killed," she said, forcing herself to look him in the eye. "He won't hesitate if he thinks you're interfering." James gave a small shrug. "Life's risk, ma'am. I've faced it before. If it means doing some good for someone who's trapped, I'll take that gamble." Her breath caught. She realized she was on the verge of trusting a near stranger with her life, and potentially her mother's life as well. Yet something in James's demeanor, calm, unwavering, not a trace of bravado, convinced her that he was exactly the kind of man who would follow through on his word. She nodded slowly. "All right," she said, voice trembling. "I don't know how or when, but thank you." Their conversation ended abruptly when the saloon doors swung open and a trio of men stomped inside, spurs clinking. Eva stiffened, but they weren't McAllister's men. Still, it was a warning. Time was short, and eyes were everywhere. Eva stood up first. "If something changes, I'll send word through Rufus," she whispered. "He's the only one I trust at the ranch." James nodded his eyes, never leaving her face. "I'll be waiting. And be careful." Heart pounding, Eva made her exit. Stepping back into the scorching midday sun, she felt her chest tighten with a mixture of dread and the faintest glimmer of hope. For the first time in months, She had a plan, albeit a dangerous one. Returning to the ranch, Eva was greeted by McAllister's scowl. He stood on the veranda, arms crossed, the midday heat rippling around him. "Where the hell have you been?" he demanded. Eva forced her voice to remain steady. "Santa Fe," she replied. "Needed supplies." He eyed her saddlebags, rummaged through them, and grunted. Seemingly satisfied, he barked an order for her to take his horse to the far corral. She did so without complaint, steeling herself for another day of carefully measured words and fearful glances. That evening, she found a brief moment alone in the barn with Rufus. Keeping her voice low, she revealed she'd met with James and told him of her predicament. Rufus listened, eyes widening, then let out a slow whistle. "You're playing with fire," he warned. "McAllister won't forgive a betrayal. Not ever." "I know," Eva whispered, hands trembling. "But James wants to help. We just need a plan. A safe place to take my mother, and then a way to get me free. I can't live like this anymore." "Rufus?" The old ranch hand scratched his stubbly chin. "If McAllister catches wind, we're all dead. But I'll do what I can. When I go to Santa Fe for the monthly supplies, I'll see if I can pass a message along." Their conversation was cut short when Gil, another ranch hand, ambled into the barn, whistling tunelessly. Eva quickly busied herself with brushing one of the horses, while Rufus resumed his saddle repairs. But her heart pounded painfully. Every conversation was a risk. Every secret word was a potential death sentence. Days turned into a tense haze. Eva continued her chores, half expecting McAllister to corner her at any moment with accusations of betrayal. But he seemed preoccupied, flipping between sour moods and triumphant boasts about new cattle deals. She could see he was barely holding his operation together. Late at night, through the thin walls, she heard him mutter curses about loans, cheating card players, and how no one respects me enough. Meanwhile, Rufus discreetly left a note at the general store in Santa Fe, addressed to James. The plan was vague. They needed a safe house for Eva's mother. Someplace McAllister wouldn't think to look, and they needed a moment, a single window of time when Eva could slip away without drawing suspicion. Finally, word came back through a traveling peddler named Silas, who had a quiet arrangement with Rufus. Silas delivered a sealed piece of paper to Rufus, who passed it to Eva under the guise of handing her some cloth. The note read, "Found a place near Silver Creek. An old friend of mine, Mary Henderson, runs a small boarding house. She's trustworthy and doesn't ask questions. If your mother can travel, we'll move her first. Then we'll come for you. L." Eva felt a dizzying relief and dread. Silver Creek was a day's ride away, a secluded spot with fewer prying eyes. It was as good a chance as any. But how would they convince her mother to leave without McAllister finding out? And how would she make the actual escape? She drafted a short reply, her handwriting shaky. "My mother might resist leaving without seeing me safe first. But I'll try. God willing, we can make this happen. E." She left the note where Silas would find it, hidden in the bottom of a flour sack he was to pick up from the barn. The next day Silas departed, and a new wave of anxiety settled in. All Eva could do was wait, keeping her face neutral in front of McAllister, while internally her mind raced with every potential catastrophe. The tension snapped one evening when McAllister, returning from a card game, slammed the door and bellowed for Eva. She rushed to the foyer, heart in her throat. He was livid, face flushed red under the brim of his hat. "Where's my dinner?" he roared, though it was only a few minutes past supper time. Eva opened her mouth to apologize, but he shoved her against the wall, his whiskey-laced breath hissing into her ear. "You think you can just stand here looking pretty and not do what you're told?" Fear seized her, but also a spark of anger. She squared her shoulders, looking him in the eye. "It's in the oven," she said evenly. "I was just—" He didn't let her finish. His slap came fast, staggering her. She cried out, stumbling, the metallic taste of blood filling her mouth. A roar of anguish erupted in her chest. She grabbed the nearest object, a pewter plate, and threw it at him. It clanged off his shoulder harmlessly, but enraged him further. "How dare you!" he shouted, lunging. He wrenched her arm painfully, his face twisted with fury. "You ungrateful!" In that moment, Rufus appeared in the doorway, eyes wide. He hesitated only a second before intervening. "Boss, she didn't mean nothing by it," Rufus said, voice trembling but resolute. "She's just— Get out!" McAllister snarled, shoving Rufus aside. He maintained his grip on Eva's arm, his knuckles white. At that instant, Eva thought her life might end. But then some shred of self-control seemed to hold McAllister back from further violence. Perhaps he realized that if he injured her too badly, the entire ranch would descend into chaos. He released Eva with a scowl. "You'd better watch yourself," he warned, voice low. "Don't think I won't do worse next time." Shaking Eva clutched her throbbing arm. McAllister stomped away, presumably heading to the study to drown his rage in more whiskey. Rufus hurried to her side. "You all right?" he whispered, voice cracking with concern. Eva nodded through tears, though her wrist felt sprained. "I'm okay," she managed, pressing her lips together to stop them from quivering. Inside, however, she was a storm of terror, fury, and despair. Later that night, once the house was quiet, Eva sat in her small bedroom, knees drawn to her chest. Her cheek stung, and bruises were already forming on her arm. She stared at the reflection in her cracked mirror, a pale, frightened woman with too many secrets and too few options. The plan with James felt more urgent than ever. She couldn't endure this much longer. She wouldn't. A week passed without further word from James. McAllister seemed to return to a more normal pattern of belittling remarks and controlling behavior, leaving actual physical violence aside. But Eva sensed a shift in the household. The ranch hands were on edge, as if anticipating a blowout. McAllister's finances were precarious, and his gambling losses only added to the tension. Finally, one chilly morning, Rufus caught Eva alone near the corral. "We got word," he said, pressing another small note into her hand. "Silas rode in last night. Seems Landon's found a way to move your mother first. Says they'll come for her in 2 days." Eva glanced around to be sure no one was watching, then opened the note. "We'll come to your mother's homestead at dawn. Don't be there yourself too risky. Have her pack light. After she's safe, we'll send for you. Be ready." Her heart soared and sank simultaneously. She wanted to see her mother, to reassure her. But James was right. If Eva disappeared from the ranch, McAllister would suspect something. She had to trust them to do it without her. She took a deep breath. "My mother's stubborn. She might refuse to go unless she sees me. Rufus, could you? I'll ride out there tomorrow," he offered before she finished. "I'll explain as best I can and help her pack. But after that, Eva, it's in the Lord's hands." Eva squeezed his hand in gratitude. "Thank you." That night, McAllister announced he was leaving for a neighboring ranch the following afternoon to settle some cattle business. He planned to be gone for at least a day. Eva feigned disinterest, though inside she felt a crackle of anticipation. If he was away, it would be easier to coordinate her final escape. The next morning, McAllister departed flanked by 2 ranch hands. Rufus also left ostensibly to pick up supplies, but in reality to visit Ava's mother. Ava spent the day under the watchful eyes of Gil and Paco, who seemed suspicious of her every move. She occupied herself with laundry cooking and tidying, mentally counting down the hours. When dusk fell, Ava paced the kitchen, candlelight dancing on the walls. She prayed for Rufus James and her mother. Would they succeed? Or would McAllister catch wind of it? Just before midnight, Rufus slipped back into the ranch. Eva cornered him in the barn. "Did it go all right?" she asked, voice trembling with worry. Rufus nodded. Exhaustion etched on his face. "Your mother's safe. I waited until dawn, just like James said. He and a woman with a wagon arrived. Mary Henderson, I guess. They got your mother loaded up traveling light. She was scared, but she went. I stayed behind to make sure no one else saw." Relief flooded Ava, and she nearly collapsed against the barn wall, tears streaming down her face. "Thank God," she whispered. But now the final part loomed her own escape. Rufus placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "James says he'll contact me about the next step. Might be tomorrow, might be next week. But just hold tight, we'll get you out." Ava nodded, wiping her tears. Even with her mother safe, the risk was colossal. If McAllister suspected anything, he could still take revenge on the rest of them. She braced herself for the challenge that was coming. McAllister returned the next evening, reeking of whiskey. He complained about the other ranchers' unfair deals, so Eva played the dutiful wife, offering him food and a fresh bed. Inside, she was a coil of tension. The next afternoon, while Eva was in the kitchen peeling potatoes, Gil burst through the door, shouting McAllister's name. Eva's heart seized. Gil held a piece of paper in his hand, waving it wildly. "Boss, this came from Santa Fe. It's urgent." McAllister snatched the paper eyes, scanning quickly. His face contorted in confusion and rage. "What in the devil?" He shot a suspicious glance at Eva. "My contact in Santa Fe says Mary Henderson took in a sick woman, claims it's Carter's widow." "That's your mother." Eva's hands trembled. She forced a look of surprise. My mother. But how did she get there?" McAllister's eyes narrowed dangerously. "That's what I'd like to know. She's supposed to be living on that scrap of land we paid off. If she's gone to Santa Fe, maybe she's run off on some fool's errand." "But why wouldn't she tell us?" Eva shrugged, feigning concern, while her mind raced. "Maybe she needed medical help," she offered. McAllister grunted. "If she's sick, why not come to me? We have a doctor here in Santa Fe I could pay." His gaze bore into Eva, a silent accusation. "I'm going to find out what's going on." He stormed out, leaving Ava clutching the potato peeler. Anxiety coursed through her veins. She needed to warn James that McAllister was onto something. But how? She found Rufus in the stable yard, quickly relaying what happened. "We have to get word to James. McAllister might head to Mary's place and track them down." Rufus set his jaw. "I'll try. But we gotta move fast." That night, under the pretense of checking the fences, Rufus left the ranch. Eva didn't know if he'd be able to intercept McAllister or James in time. The hours dragged on every creak of the house, making her flinch. McAllister spent the evening snapping at the ranch hands, then locked himself in his study, presumably preparing for an early departure. At dawn, Eva woke to the sound of McAllister saddling up. He glared at her when he noticed her standing by the corral. "I'm heading out," he muttered. "Don't wait up." Eva wanted to plead with him not to go to avert disaster, But she knew that would only rouse his suspicion further. So she watched him ride away, a lump in her throat the size of a boulder. 2 days passed with no sign of McAllister or Rufus. Eva's nerves were frayed. She barely slept, jumping at every noise in the dark. On the 3rd day, Rufus returned looking haggard. He pulled Eva aside, voice trembling. "I found James at Mary's. Your mother is safe, but McAllister showed up shortly after I arrived. He caused a ruckus, accused Mary of harboring his property's mother. James convinced him your mother was there for medical help. McAllister left, but not without threats. He's suspicious as hell." Eva exhaled shakily. "So he didn't hurt anyone?" "Not this time," Rufus said. "But now he's watching the roads. He's got a few hired guns posted near the edges of the ranch, keeping an eye out for suspicious activity. He knows something's up." Despair took hold of Eva. If McAllister was tightening security, how could she possibly escape? She voiced her fears to Rufus. He patted her shoulder. "James has a plan," he said quietly. "Might be risky, but if you want out, this could be our only chance." That evening, after the ranch hands had settled in, and McAllister was in his study, a coded message arrived for Rufus. A young boy delivered it, claiming it was from a local store. The note read, "We ride at dawn, day after tomorrow. The eastern trail is clear for 2 hours. Have her meet me by the old oak near the river. L." Ava's heart pounded as she read it. 2 days. She would have to be ready. Dawn. The old oak near the river was about a mile from the ranch, an isolated spot. From there, she and James could presumably outrun McAllister's men if they had a head start. The plan hinged on sneaking out of the house without alerting McAllister. Eva thought of the many nights she'd crept around to do chores, carefully avoiding floorboards that squeaked. She could manage it. The real question was whether she had the courage to walk away from everything she'd known, risk McAllister's wrath. But wasn't her life already a cage? With trembling determination, she made her preparations. She packed a small satchel with a change of clothes, some keepsakes from her mother and father, and a few small bills she'd managed to save. Each day leading to the appointed dawn felt like an eternity. Finally, the night arrived. Eva waited until McAllister drank himself into a stupor, listened for his heavy snores. Then she slipped out of bed. Her heart hammered as she crept through the hallway, carefully stepping around the spots she knew would creak. She made it outside without incident, where Rufus waited with a horse saddled. She breathed her thanks, tears in her eyes. "I can't ever repay you." Rufus managed a weary smile. "Just make it out alive," he whispered. "And if you do say a prayer for an old fool who stuck around too long." His words made her want to beg him to come too, but they both knew that might raise too many questions. Rufus staying behind would at least delay McAllister's realization of betrayal. With a final nod, Eva mounted the horse. The moon was high, illuminating the path toward the river. She rode with her heart pounding in her ears, scanning the shadows for any sign of McAllister's men. Her mind spun with 1,000 fears. If they caught her now, what would McAllister do? But she pressed onward, the silhouette of the old oak slowly coming into view against the moonlit sky. As she approached, she saw a figure on horseback. James. Relief rushed through her so powerfully she almost doubled over. He rode up beside her, calm but clearly tense. "You okay?" he asked, scanning her face. She nodded, though tears stung her eyes. "This way," he murmured, leading her along a winding path that skirted the main roads. The plan was to ride east, then south, eventually reaching Silver Creek, where her mother waited. They hadn't gone more than 2 miles when a gunshot rang out behind them. Eva's heart lurched. Then came another shot. James spurred his horse faster, guiding Eva to do the same. Hoofbeats thundered in the distance. They were being pursued. Eva's heart pounded as the trail twisted sharply through the rocky terrain. Behind her, the single remaining pursuer was relentless, his horse gaining ground. She urged her mare forward, tears stinging her eyes from wind and fear. Every hoofbeat felt like a countdown to capture. Then another gunshot cracked through the morning air. Eva flinched, but it wasn't aimed at her. Rufus stood on a ridge above his rifle, raised and steady. The shot struck the outlaw's shoulder, spinning him from his saddle. Eva gasped in relief as Rufus waved her on. "Don't stop now," he shouted. "Ride!" She did. Gravel flew beneath her lungs, burning until finally she reached the open plain and the boot-shaped rock James had described. She waited, praying eyes darting across the horizon. Minutes later, James appeared, blood seeping through a sleeve, but alive. He dismounted and reached for her hand, his voice ragged. "You made it." "Rufus, he saved me," Eva said, eyes wide with worry. James's face tightened. He knew the risk. "We'll go back for him when it's safe." They wrapped his wound quickly and rode in silence toward Silver Creek. Each mile felt like a lifetime, but with every stride, Eva felt her chains falling away. She looked at James beside her, bloodied, silent, strong, and something in her heart settled. This wasn't just escape. It was rebirth. Behind them, the sun rose over the horizon, casting light on the beginning of something neither of them had dared to dream. Each morning at the boarding house, sunlight filtered through the curtains like a quiet blessing. Eva awoke to peace instead of dread, a new rhythm of safety. She helped Mary in the kitchen, took walks with her mother, and slowly relearned what it meant to breathe freely. James kept watch, always near, but never in sync. Sometimes he'd sit with Eva on the porch, whittling wood in silence, while she mended clothes or simply watched the wind in the cottonwoods. Despite the calm, Eva's thoughts often drifted to Rufus. Had he survived? Would she ever get to thank him for his sacrifice? News was scarce, but she held hope in her heart. One afternoon, James brought her a single wildflower and said simply, "You're blooming." Eva smiled genuinely for the first time in what felt like years. The past hadn't vanished, but it no longer owned her. And in that, she found the first spark of freedom. In the quiet days that followed, Eva found herself watching James from the porch, his calm presence a balm to her soul. He never pushed, never demanded, simply offered kindness and time. Her mother too began to smile again, helping Mary with small chores and stitching in the afternoons. One evening as stars blanketed the sky, Eva sat beside James near the corral. "I still have scars," she said softly. "But I'm not broken anymore." James looked at her, his voice steady. "Scars mean you survived. That's strength, not weakness." She reached for his hand, no longer hesitant. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was safe, full of promise. They didn't speak of marriage or forever. Not yet. But in every glance, every shared chore they built something enduring. Love not born from rescue, but respect. Slowly, Eva began to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was the life she was meant to live all along. Weeks turned to months as Eva and her mother found peace at Mary Henderson's boarding house. With McAllister rumored crippled and disgraced, the fear slowly faded. James gained respect, training horses, and Eva began healing, rediscovering her strength. One crisp morning, James took Eva riding through wildflower-strewn meadows. Breathless under the open sky, he dismounted and gently said, "Let's build something new together." Eva, eyes brimming, stepped into his arms. The past no longer held her captive. In that moment, surrounded by sunlight and possibility, she saw a future free, fearless, and filled with love. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the dusty roads and hidden heartbreaks of the Old West. Eva's story reminds us that even in the darkest corners, a single spark of hope can illuminate the way forward. From her forced marriage to a ruthless rancher, to finding an unexpected ally in the quiet cowboy who risked everything to save her, she discovered a courage she never knew she had. If you've been moved by this tale of struggle, survival, and redemption, please do take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Every click helps us keep these powerful stories alive and spread them to those who might need a reminder that there's always a way out of the shadows. Together, let's honor the resilience of the human spirit and continue telling stories that inspire hope. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.